So I invite you to reflect with me on what I'm calling a reflection on the spiritual dynamics of what has taken place and what it means for human beings. And we've talked for a couple of weeks now about the spiritual dynamics of abuse and trauma. We've talked about loss of autonomy, free agency, and the imposing of the freedom or liberty of another, of one onto the other, and therefore reducing their freedom. So, and this is taking us back into that space to some extent, and we'll make some challenging statements, I hope, about the nature of power in institutional context, because child sexual abuse is, I think it's widely accepted now, predominantly about power. Any kind of sexual abuse is actually predominantly about power. It's about often a misapprehension in the abuser of themselves and their relationship to the other, a misapprehension of what it means to offer dignity and care to the other, and a sense of permission for unbridled or unchecked, unreflective power to be utilised at any time by anyone. And it's broader than that, obviously, but they're some of the core tenets of it. So I'm going to start by saying institutions represent a great risk to the free agency and dignified humility of the human person. Are they only a risk? Firstly, do you agree that institutions represent a great risk to the free agency and dignified humility of the human person? Absolutely. They do? So they always represent a risk. So wherever human beings gather together and form structures around how we relate to one another or how we relate to others, there is an inherent risk of some form of diminishing of the human person, the individual.
Even if it's just a bowling club.
So why do we do it? Why do we form ourselves into institutions and social groups and so on?
Same like-minded person, same direction, thinking.
Yeah.
But if you see the positive aspect of it, it can also protect.
Right. So groups protect us. Yep, absolutely. I think you're spot on, James. So it's actually part of our evolution that we have formed into groups, tribes, family groups, and so on, in order to make it easier to gather and hunt for food. Obviously, it's within those contexts that we form relationships, mate and have children, and so continue our species. And we've developed all kinds of structures, languages and symbols that help to protect those groups. And of course, conflict with other groups also helps to define and protect our group. And the Hebrew Bible is full of tribalism. You know, it's a rather magnificent set of stories that talk about how, you know, our God is bigger and better than your God, you know, and so on and so forth. But it's part of who we are. We relate. We form groups. We share symbols. We share languages, and we put mechanisms in place to enable us to impact, change, grow, create in our environment. So it's natural, yeah. So to say that institutions are inherently evil would be probably overreaching, wouldn't it? It'd be a bit silly to say that, because they're just things that we do. But they always represent a risk to us. And yeah, James.
Sorry, the problem comes when bad people are in authority.
When bad people are in
Or
authority.
Sick people.
Okay.
Sick people. If a person, a pedophile, is in authority, he used that chance to abuse. So, I mean, in the human history we have seen when people come to power, whether it's in the church or in the government, they abuse their power. That's why we have Second World Wars. People abusing their power. So, it's due to bad people.
Yeah, I agree that that cultures of leadership involving people who are non-reflective and abusers of power and other people are a huge factor in this. I don't think it's the only factor. I think it's a huge factor. Any reading of Hannah Arendt's book on the Eichmann in Jerusalem, remember I showed you that book, A Report into the Banality of Evil, fantastic title, will remind us that yes, the crisis in leadership is often at the core and at the centre, but the systems that support that and that create it, and the systems that enable others to participate without necessarily perceiving themselves as doing anything particularly wrong, are insidious. Now, you could argue, and I did argue in the Canberra Times a few years ago, that all Australians are currently complicit in a great moral evil because we are participating in a system that incarcerates innocent people offshore and leaves them there indefinitely without justice. How, in that sense, are we different from other groups of people who we can easily point to and say, oh, look, you horrible people, you did that? History will judge our society as well. Eichmann defended himself by saying, well, I was just a public servant, you know. I was a trained timetabler. I was just good at my job. I was told to get a system going whereby the Jewish community could be shifted to the east, and I did it. I didn't make the law. I never broke the law in my country. I was an upstanding public servant, good at my job. What else are you going to say? And Hannah Arendt, a Jewish philosopher, said, well, he's right. Actually, he's right. That doesn't get him off. But he participated in a banal, kind of normal system that he could perhaps easily justify, you know. And we know that so many people in that society did justify their participation in what turned out to be a horrific collective situation.
As we are today, justifying.
Yeah, right.
We're ignoring or...
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
And it's not even the evil actions. Sometimes it's just the ignorant inactions that contributes.
That's right.
And those two together create a disaster. It often does require those two elements.
Yeah, when good people do nothing. Yeah, that's right.
And just to mention, I don't actually accept the concept of evil.
Right, there you go. Yeah.
I don't think there's such a thing.
And it there's a whole philosophical discussion there to be fantastic to have. I'm just gone straight to Raymond Gator, who talks about good and evil. You can't separate them. They're kind of just, you know. Anyway, we can maybe we'll do a unit on the nature of good and evil sometime, pastoral care. But yeah, that's a great question to raise. So I'm beginning by saying that whilst institutions are intrinsically part of who we are as human beings, they always carry a risk. And the beginning point for us as we seek to discern how to be spiritually caring in the context of institutions is to recognise the inherent risk that we participate in right from the beginning. Doesn't matter how good, you know, it might be just the local footy club. Hey, it's great, you know, it's all good. But the recognition that there is always the risk present here where people group together for someone to be hurt and for all of us not to realise how it actually got to that point. The shock of institutions realising that they were complicit in these situations is palpable, isn't it? Hang on, how did we let this happen? In some other institutions, there's, of course, ongoing denial. You know,
Which is the same thing.
perhaps, yeah, just different ways we can respond to it. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse has revealed that institutional contexts represent a considerable risk of abuse to vulnerable people who are within their sphere of influence. Fair enough? Yeah. The spiritual dynamic that is manifest in institutions that allow child sexual abuse to occur and that continue to protect the institution contrary to the claims for justice by its victims can be characterised as, here it is, this is what I'm asserting, the assertion of heteronymous power and the forced subjugation of the autonomy of the individual subject to that heteronomy. Do you know what heteronomy is? Collective authority. So you've kind of got, in Paul Tillich's thought, and this is not only in his thought, it's common, you've kind of got autonomy, and heteronomy. What's autonomy? Personal agency, individual, capacity to define oneself, to determine one's own ideas, thoughts, actions, and so on. It's often also characterised as individualism, you know. Heteronomy is up the other end of, this is not exactly a spectrum, what would you call it? A spectrum's a circle, isn't it? Continuum, thank you. Where the group, the whole, the institution, the organism, I don't know, all of those kinds of collectivist ideas hold the authority. So the individual takes second place to the group. A classic, classical communist ideologies, I suppose, would be more heteronymous than, you know, but also the big Christian denominations, you know, Anglicanism, Catholicism, Orthodox churches and so on and so forth, fall firmly up in the heteronymous end of things. Okay, so the collective holds greater authority than the individual. In the Christian tradition, radical Protestantism, and this college here is a kind of an example of what happens when radical Protestants get together. They said, not to put too politely, get lost to the heteronomy, and placed all the emphasis on the individual conscience, the individual human conscience and intellect to be able to interpret their texts and to be able to understand what moral agency means and to determine what it means to believe or not to believe, or, you know, all of those sorts of things became the province of the individual. And that was all alongside the Enlightenment and so on, as human beings started to collectively embrace individual reason and the capacity to reflect on one's own life and have some personal authority in one's own life. Yeah. And there's always a tension in our human experience between these two things. We always exist somewhere. We can't be completely autonomous, because that would mean we wouldn't be able to interact with anyone ever. Do you see what I mean? So some of us fall up here, and some of us fall up here, and some of us up here, and some of us, you know, the anarchists might try and push this way a bit. Do you know what I mean? So that's one of those dynamics. And I'm suggesting that in an institutional context where child abuse takes place, the heteronymous power of the institution subjugates the free agency, autonomous power of the individual. So the sum of the parts subjugates the parts. Questions? Comments?
So, to put a personal, to create a little personal story from that, you have a Christian church or a Hindu ashram, which is the heteronomy.
Mm-hmm.
You have the young child who has limited autonomy anyway,
Mm-hmm.
but then you have the priest or the guru or the brother or the whoever it might be,
Mhm.
So the heteronomy might protect the capacity for that person to do that without consequence.
Yep.
But it's still the autonomous person who makes the
Yep.
decision.
Yep. The conditions
Well,
don't.
yes.
Yeah, I agree. The conditions don't in any way reduce the personal responsibility of the abuser, but they create the conditions under which the abuser is
can
able to be an
thrive.
abuser. Yeah.
It thrives,
Mm.
not to
That's
use
right.
too revolting a word to
Yeah.
describe it.
Yeah.
Again, here if you take it the heteronomy arrangement, it can also have positive effects. So as a whole institution, they can make a decision.
Mm.
Like I give you an example because I was living in Hong Kong.
Mm.
The whole Catholic Church took a decision, 0 tolerance.
Yep.
Any case reported, immediately it will be reported to the police.
Yep.
The police does the investigation. There is a child abuse, and if it is proven, the person is not allowed to function
Mm.
as a priest or as anything.
Yep.
So, as a whole institution, the action can be taken.
Mm.
But in an autonomy, if somebody is doing, and he can continue to.
Mm.
So that's what we see. The pedophile people, they are traveling to Thailand,
Right.
Cambodia.
If there's absolute
So
free agency
there's
with
no
no
check and balance.
collective check, absolutely. Yep, you're absolutely right. And so that's why we describe the dynamics as being, we're not saying heteronomy is inherently evil. We're saying when the dynamics occur of heteronymous power subjugating autonomy in the individuals that are the collective parts of that, to the point where they can be subjected to the power and the needs and the outcomes of the collective,
There's
then
a-
you've got part of the conditions under which this can take place.
There's a platform upon which that sits, which is values or ethics or morality.
Mm.
That the tension, I think, is pulled this way and that by
Mm.
values, ethics and
Mm.
morality.
Yeah. If under the conditions of a strong heteronomy, the full humanity of individual beings is lost sight of,
Yeah.
we're in strife. Beth?
We're very accustomed
Mm-hmm.
to thinking about honouring the full value of human beings in individualist terms, though.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways of understanding the full expression of humanness as being essentially connected.
Yep.
And so to push too far towards autonomy as the defining, like this is how you know that you've protected your humanity by having these completely impenetrable boundaries around a person, we actually give up some of our humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why when we talk about the conditions under which life will thrive, we talk about the balance between free agency and attachment and dependence. Which is what we were talking about last. So if you're going to talk about the individual, I was just going to draw something on the board, but we don't have to. Then you can't talk about the individual as an isolated thing, because individuals are by definition relational. So, but to abolish any sense of the individual is also to abolish any sense of relatedness, isn't it? That's my understanding, is that it takes otherness, difference, in order for true relatedness to take place. If we're all sort of absorbed into one sort of nebulous identity, then we lose relatedness. That is a fantastic conversation that we can have.
Accountability.
And
Because in the corporate heteronomy,
yeah.
in which I include religious
Mm.
structures, no one's accountable. The structure of a business corporation is that there is nobody, a listed business corporation on the stock exchange is accountable to the shareholders.
Mm.
What does that mean?
Profit.
Who decides what's right and wrong?
Yeah.
And so there is no account, and humanity in it
Mm.
anymore.
So Paul Tillich said that this wobbly, inappropriate heteronomy takes place when the institution explicitly or implicitly invests itself with ultimate significance.
Yes.
And that can happen actually without, it can happen by accident.
It
You know.
has a logical progression.
Yeah. Yeah. The institution that invests itself with ultimate significance necessarily demands the full subjugation, surrender of free agency or autonomy of the individual subjects that come within its sphere of influence. The phenomenon of silence that surrounds child sexual abuse in institutional contexts, including the institution of the family, if you want to call that an institution, which people do, represents this spirit of heteronymous power. And it's kind of revealed in this quote, which I'm not sure if you've read this yet in Van der Kolk's book, but this Roland Summit says this when he's sort of describing this. Initiation, intimidation, stigmatisation, isolation, helplessness and self-blame depend on the terrifying reality of child abuse. And it is almost in a sense describing a process that takes place within the institution. Initiation, building trust. I don't know if you read some of the stories. We're going to go through one of them together at the end today. But that the process that unfolds, that begins with actually instituting aspects of human relating that appear to be good and affirming and life-giving. And this is what leads to the labelling of these processes as evil, and we'll talk about why later. And that is because something that is supposed to be or has the appearance of being good manifests itself to be absent by the agency of another person, and suddenly the opposite occurs. So initiation, that's initiation. Intimidation, the consequence, when it becomes clear that I am being abused, I am kept silent because no longer are the good things surrounding me. There is now an implicit threat. Stigmatisation, something's wrong with you, something's wrong with me. I must be at fault. Isolation, you can feel the silence gathering. Helplessness and self-blame. And these quotes, don't worry about things like that. That could never happen in our family. How could you ever think of such a terrible thing? Don't ever let me hear you say anything like that again. They're horrific, silencing dynamics. And they're spiritual dynamics in human relationships. And then he finishes with that devastating fact: the average child never asks and never tells.
And that's a fractal thing, isn't it? The abuser does those things in micro, like direct one-to-one.
Yeah.
And then the institution does exactly the same thing at an institution level.
That's right.
So they feed each other.
Yeah.
Protect each other.
Yep. And we talked about that earlier, didn't we, when we were talking about the spiritual dynamics and so on, that people never do what they do in complete vacuums or isolation from other. That's what Beth was saying. We're implicitly related creatures. And, on an almost completely tangential tangent, that's why I don't believe in capital punishment. because capital punishment suggests that a human being could be in total isolation, fully responsible for their own actions. And we simply know that that's not true. We know that all human beings represent us, who we are. And so we ought to take responsibility, our own responsibility for what that person has done. And so to just kill them and say, oh, that's it, we've rid ourselves of the blight on our humanity is an illusion. It's a delusion. Because in fact, the conditions that created that person are our conditions, and we need to keep them with us in order to be present to ourselves and keep working on. And that's the same here. This recognition that actually this is us. This is our problem. It's really easy to point the finger at the Catholic Church or the government home or the priest over there or the sports massager over there, or it's easy to pick out the demons, in a sense, the people with little red horns and tails, and say they're the evil ones. It's harder to say actually this is our problem. Did I tell you that story? I was driving in the car in Canberra. There was a discussion on the radio about racism. No? This lady rang up. They were talking about racism and its presence in our community. This lady rang up and she said, hi, my name's, Fran. I'm racist. Shock, silence. What do you mean? What do you mean you're right? We try and protect. And she says, step one. It's taken me years to realise that step one is for me to admit that I participate in community and cultural structures that make me implicitly racist. She said, now that I know that, and I've been able to name it to myself, I can begin to recognise when it's occurring in me and I can change. But until I make that step, forget it. So while we point the finger, we're not necessarily doing the hard work that needs to be done as participants in a society and a culture that have allowed this to happen.
But do you think for people like Bin Laden, you would ever change? Stop killing people in the name of religion?
Yeah, yep. To be alive is to change and adapt. If you can't change and adapt, you die. So I actually think all human beings always change and adapt. Ask Bin Laden's mother, he was a lovely boy until he fell in with those people at university and he changed. Well, if he can change that way, he can change that way as well. I know our synaptic connections kind of get a bit harder to make the older we get, but they keep happening. That's why we're told to start learning a language when we're 60. Yeah.
And it's necessary sometimes to protect the person from doing any more.
Yeah, but great question. Yeah.
Which doesn't mean you have to kill them.
Yeah.
I've never understood how using violence to resolve violence is sensible.
We've got to get moving. When institutional culture reveals an investment in the ultimate significance of the institution that causes the subjugation of the individual, the conditions known as the demonic occur. Now, we're not talking about, as I just said, we're not talking about little demons, little ghosts running around causing us to do nasty things. The demonic in this kind of thinking refers to any collective process or structure that renders its individual parts to be powerless, renders them powerless. So you and I are powerless to change things because the structure, the overall structure, renders us that way. And this happens in politics all the time. Ask anyone in this room, do you think it's right to incarcerate asylum seekers indefinitely without justice on Manus Island? I'd be surprised if any of us said, yeah, it's a great idea, let's go for it, and yet, we have bipartisan support for the policy in Australian politics, and as a democracy, people like us are rendered powerless. And we feel it as an external power that stops us from living and thriving fully. And that's the definition of, the demons in the ancient sacred texts did that to people. They rendered them powerless. So that's what we mean in that sense when we talk about the demonic. It's a dynamic, a human dynamic. The recommendations of the Royal Commission state unequivocally that institutions must uphold the shared value of the rights of the child. That's found in Recommendation 6.4. From a spiritual perspective, we take this to refer to the recognition of the child as a human person with all traits of humanity to be recognised as intrinsic to the person and valued as a full and free agent of the society in which we live. Now, Beth's going to challenge us further on definitions of what it means to be a child and a full human person after the break. Spiritual care represents the human intention of listening deeply and being present to the autonomous individual in a way that reveals for the person themselves and for the society and its institutional structures the intrinsic human preciousness of that person. It upholds the life-promoting balance of freedom, agency, and dependence, attachment, relationship, connectedness. That's kind of what we're about. Now, when you walk in and sit down and listen to someone, you're not going to say, "Hi, I'm here to protect the balance of free agency and dependence in your life." But, we're thinking deeply about what it means to offer spiritual care here. What are we listening for? Now, I don't know if this has ever happened to you before, but it happened to a friend of mine who got kind of caught in a triangulated situation as a spiritual carer at the hospital. Person rings up. My mum's in hospital. She needs A, B and C. Can you please go and chat to her and help her work through A, B and C so that we can do A, B and C at home or whatever, whatever. What was happening was the child was calling on the services of the spiritual carer to essentially manipulate the mother into fulfilling the wishes of the child.
She's broken, can you go fix her?
Yeah, and in this case, the spiritual carer was they were all a member of the same religious community, and the spiritual carer got confused. Who am I caring for here? And that person accidentally protected the interests of the daughter. I don't think she didn't mean to cause harm, but she forgot that when she was present to the mother, she was there for the mother. And the same thing can happen for us when we are in institutions. We can accidentally get caught in this confusion about who we're there for. Are we there to protect the beliefs and the values and the structures and the rules of the institution, or are we there to be present to the person in front of us? The person in front of us in our line of work always trumps the institution, without exception. Even when that person maybe represents an infringement of normal human helpful behaviour. We're not there to be the agents of the church or the agents of the court or the agents of the political state. We're there to be present to the human person in front of us. And this includes children as our equals. And I think a huge proportion of the recommendations, I think underlying, a lot of it's kind of fairly administrational stuff, put these processes in place, have these forms, get these checks, it all feels fairly dry, but underlying it is recognise that the people you are with are human beings, full human beings, as you are, and allow their presence and their agency to be voiced and allow their power to be part of the picture. As I said earlier, it's commonly understood that sexual abuse occurs where social institutions are vested with power at the expense of the power of the individual. individual power that we might call life actualisation, which is actually a Paul Tillich word. That's the way he describes power, life actualisation. So power is a good thing. Right? We all have power. We all want power. We all assert power. It's the way we be in our environment and stay alive. So power in itself is not the problem. It's the dynamics of power that subjugate one under the other that become the problem. So individual power that we might call life actualisation depends on the right conditions to be present within which life can be actualised through freedom and dependence. Relatedness. Healthy individual power always defers an element of personal agency to the social institution as a form of its spiritual life. In other words, that's a complicated way of saying we need to rely on each other. We need to be able to rely on each other. And so we voluntarily trust. We place ourselves in the hands of others. That's what we mean when we talk about dependency or attachment or relatedness. And that's a good thing. Yet when the institution becomes all-powerful and diminishes the individual power of the subject, or as some of you have rightly indicated, in an imbalanced way enables the wrong power of other individuals, the conditions that threaten life and individual agency are created. It is these conditions that created the spiritual environment in which sexual abuse of children can take place. Let's just pause for a minute and consider that idea that the abuser within the institution has a greater level of freedom and agency. There's a question in there for me than the person they're abusing, which is, I mean, in a sense, an obvious thing. Does someone who abuses others, are they expressing a fullness of life? Would you say that, their life has been given fuller expression at the expense of their abuser's life? Would you necessarily make it that easily stated? What sort of life is the abuser living?
More like they're trying to rob the life of someone else in order to give themselves more life rather than just them expressing their own life.
Yeah. Right, so they're living almost vicariously through the suffering of another. Wow, yeah, that's an extraordinary observation.
Maybe the abuser also had previous abuse.
Right, so sometime, yep.
And therefore you want to test it out on someone or do it on someone to see how the person feel, like what he had felt.
Right.
Maybe that way.
Which may be a conscious rationalisation of it. I mean, the development of a person who has been abused themselves is a complex story of incredible suffering and does sometimes lead to re-perpetration of abuse, yeah.
Absolutely. And my study of nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg, do you know?
I'm sure.
Will always say that activities that are harmful to somebody else in some way are a tragic expression of that person's unmet need.
Yeah.
So it's not they were abused themselves, they had an unmet need to understand how to show love, perhaps.
Yep, and that's why Simone Weil said, same thing. Now, that's not to say that perpetrators of abuse should not accept full responsibility for their actions. They should. But
that is
if we are to understand,
Osama bin Laden could change.
Yeah, it is, and that's what I believe.
If he figured out how to fill that void in a different way, in a more life-affirming way for himself.
Well, when you don't accept that, for a paedophile, for example, that a child before them is a very powerful object.
Yep.
Although they exert power, they actually deal with the threat of the power of the child by an
Yep.
overextension of their own power.
Yep.
But if we forget that that child is actually a powerful agent
Mm.
in the system,
Mm.
we further disempower
Yep.
children. We
Yep.
create systems. We create opportunities.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
It's not just the vulnerability.
No.
Well, vulnerability is different to weakness. It's
Yes,
not just
that's
the
right.
weakness of a
Yeah.
child.
Yeah.
In that situation, it's the power
Mm.
that creates vulnerability.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, they're like sick people, and which they are not aware that they have got a sickness.
Mm.
It's like drug addicts. They abuse other people to fulfill their desire to take drugs, like stealing or robbing or threatening parents to get the money.
Mm.
But it's because their inner desire to buy the drugs.
Mm.
So here is a person who is sick, and I guess either pedophile or any other abusive sicknesses, but he is not aware.
Mm.
But he has to fulfill that desire using other people.
So there are elements of compulsion, pre-conscious compulsion, based on our homeostatic processes, perhaps, But and I think all of these things apply in various ways.
I had with the pedophile one time. His deep sadness was the loss of connection to his friends, family, social
Yeah.
community.
Yeah.
He did not actually believe he was wrong.
Mm. Yeah.
He-
Extraordinary, isn't
so
it?
it wasn't a compulsion. He didn't actually believe
Yeah.
he was wrong.
Yeah. So it was a case of wrong thinking in that sense. Wrong. Yeah. Okay. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to race ahead. Spiritual responses to institutional conditions for child sexual abuse are complex. The appropriate response of the individual perpetrator of the abuse and the institution that created the conditions under which that abuse was made possible might be called sober remorse. I'm using the language of philosopher Raymond Gaita. In his work on sober remorse, he names true remorse as a condition in which the perpetrator recognises the full humanity of their victim. He writes that their response is saturated by the realisation of the unconditional preciousness of their victim. And I think one of the real risks for some of the big Christian institutions right now is that they're not here. They're not at this place. They're still hiding behind lawyers. They're still protecting perpetrators. They're still protecting systems in which these processes are taking place. So a right spiritual response from Christian religious institutions, and there are plenty of others too, but these are part of our community, so is not present. Now, I recognise that this is only one aspect of it, but I've got to keep going, so we can perhaps talk about it a bit later. In this, we can sense the spiritual movement towards the revelation of the victim as a human person with the right to maintain their own balance of free agency and safe attachment. Okay, so that's one element of spiritual response. The response, on the other side, of the spiritual care practitioner, when they are called upon to be in this context to provide spiritual care, must include that form of love that recognises the unconditional preciousness of the individual without condescension. So there must be mutuality in that. And the irreducible ethic of human life that undergirds the place of every individual expression of life as intrinsically valuable for the fostering of life itself. Albert Schweitzer. The cry of the human person of any and all ages is implicitly, I will to live amongst other wills to live. This cry must be heard and validated. It is this cry for life that the spiritual care practitioner must hear and validate and hold. And it takes precedence over the institution. It is a matter of justice, advocacy, and spiritual healing that the free agency of the individual must always take precedence over the free agency of the institution. We call the institutional conditions under which child sexual abuse can take place evil. Well, I do. You don't, Fran. That's okay. You can find another way of... Often when we tease these things out, we reach a sense of where we approach each other's understanding. In the Christian tradition, evil is a spiritual dynamic. It's often personified, but that's not what we mean here. We name these conditions evil in the full knowledge that by doing so we name evil as banal normality. Hannah Arendt. Evil is not present as the raging supernatural spirit personified in the mythical figure of Satan. If it were so, it would be easy to identify and defeat. No, evil is the subtle set of social and political conditions under which the reality of the intrinsically precious nature of the individual person is taken away. And we'll witness this in the story that we share together at the end. Simone Weil, in a fairly opaque French philosophical way, says, "The unreality which takes the goodness from good, this is what constitutes evil. Evil is the destruction of tangible things in which there is the real presence of good. Evil is carried out by those who have no knowledge of this real presence." So they can't recognise or they don't recognise or won't recognise for some reason the real tangible good present in the other. In that sense, it is true that no one is wicked voluntarily, and she reveals this sort of sense of things here. The relations between forces give to absence the power to destroy presence. Good and evil, reality, that which gives more reality to beings and things is good, and that which takes it from them is evil. So in a sense, in order to abuse someone, you must have a diminished sense of their realness as a human person. A diminished sense of their powerful presence, as Beth said, in the institution. In this we can see that reality is the precious humanity of the vulnerable child. Reality is represented by the fullest expression of life in the child. Free agency and safe dependence and attachment is the most real, the fullest expression of human life, thriving and creative. Any person, structure, institution that collaborates to empty the child of that which is truly real perpetrates a great evil against the child and against life itself. That's kind of what we mean by evil, you know. And when I say we, I mean we from the Western Christian tradition, Fred. And it's all right. It's good that we keep qualifying and making sure we maintain that conversation. The most difficult part of these spiritual dynamics is the recognition that all of us participate in social structures and institutions in which these dynamics are an ever-present risk to every individual and in particular to every child. Evil is a banal, everyday element of social life that does not present itself as anything other than the tedious rhythm of collective life. All of us can be players, participants in evil structures without committing obvious evil acts. Our part in the system may be simple, banal, and necessary. We can become blinded to the ways in which our small contribution to the system is one small piece in the jigsaw puzzle. This is why supervision, you can't say it enough times, is so core and central to our listening disciplines, because we are enabled through supervision to, in a sense, in a kind of ecstatic self-reflection, stand outside ourselves and have a good hard look, not only at our individual internal life, but our participation in the structures that we are part of. Examination of the self and the place of the self in the collective whole is one of the first steps towards recognition of the spiritual dynamics at play in child sexual abuse. That's it for the first lecture. Goodbye, online people, for the time being.